Chapter 3. The reporters still lolled around her driveway. They all stood at attention and snapped pictures, their flashes lighting up her front yard as she drove in. A couple were determined to stand their ground, but she continued to drive forward steadily. They would either get out of the way in time or get mowed down. She was hardly in the mood to discuss this with them. As she drove into her driveway, she pulled in front of the garage and parked. Too bad, she hadn't had a chance to empty the garage, so it was usable. It would give her a chance to get away from prying eyes. While Doreen had been sorting through some of Nan's stuff in the house, the garage was a whole different story. With mugs in tow, she walked toward the front door. What she should have done when she was out was grab some food. She was damn near out of crackers and cheese and peanut butter, and everything prepackaged. Since Mac had told her that ramen noodles were supposed to be cooked, she'd begun microwaving them with water. A constant source of poor nutrition. She had to chuckle at it all. From the front stoop, she could see Thaddeus, the great big goof, looking out the window. She had closed the curtains before she'd left because of the reporters. In fact, the curtains had been closed for days now. But the parrot had worked his head between the folds so he could look outside. Pulling his head back from the curtains, he was blocked from her sight. She knew he'd be perched on the sofa cushions waiting for her to enter. She could hear him inside squawking, "She's home. She's home." Doreen opened the door and cried out, "Yes, Thaddeus. I'm home." Muggs gave a woof as he went in and jumped onto the couch, almost on top of the cat, as if to tell off Goliath, the monster cat sprawled on the center cushion, for being there. Goliath's hiss and one swipe of his claws were followed by one last bark, and Goliath ran off. Then Muggs lay down on the couch with a disinterested glare, and closed his eyes. Doreen groaned, closed the front door with a shake of her head, and walked into the kitchen to put on the tea kettle. She dropped her notepad on the counter and said out loud, hoping Mac's ears were burning, "You're welcome, Mac. Somebody might have just died. But that's all right. Don't be worried about me or them." She wasn't being fair, of course, because Mac was worried about her safety when following the couple. Maybe they'd had a lover's tiff, but regardless of the nature of their argument, it was none of Doreen's business. The fact of the matter was, she was bored. They'd caught her eye, and she hadn't been able to let them go. On that note, she sat down at her laptop and continued her research, looking for pictures of large beds of carnations in Kelowna. She didn't want to make a mistake and pick the wrong plants. Although she loved carnations, what did they look like when they were en masse? Google Images brought up several nice pictures of local gardens. Thinking maybe she could drive around and take a closer look at these, she made herself a cup of tea and put it into her travel mug. Besides, she was restless, and Mac telling her to go home wasn't sitting so well. Technically, she did go home. She just planned on leaving once more. If she could do something constructive, then she should. Right? She put the leash on Muggs again, and ushered Thaddeus and Goliath into the car too. This trip would be a family outing. Thaddeus rode in the back passenger seat, Muggs on the other side, with Goliath riding shotgun because he would never let anybody else sit here. Life was just that easy for Goliath. But then, when you were a 30-pound Maine Coon with claws and teeth, life was pretty easy. Doreen slowly backed down the driveway, once again inching past the reporters, ignoring the flashes of their cameras going off in her face. She wondered if she should tell the media camped out in her front yard about the gunshots she had heard earlier. They'd all pack it up and head to the new crime scene, right? But that was hardly fair to the police. The media could disturb their initial investigation. When she was clear of the pesky reporters, she headed back into town. She drove toward the first of 3 carnation sites she wanted to see firsthand, starting with the one farthest away. Once there, she let the animals out to walk with her. This was a huge public garden set beside the entrance to one of the many big vineyards, privately owned by the Pollock family. The garden bed was absolutely gorgeous. She could see from where she stood how the tall carnations drooped sideways somewhat, probably because of the last rain they had had here, like a month ago. Kelowna didn't receive a lot of rain, but when it came, sometimes it poured heavily and would knock the flowers flat. As she studied these, she found they were recovering but would likely never stand straight again. So maybe these carnations weren't the best choice. Now dianthus carnations were a different story. Bright, colorful, cheerful, almost always in bloom, particularly when mature plants. Those might be a better answer. Still, Doreen had 2 more existing carnation gardens she should look at. The next garden was much smaller. The carnations were planted in circles and surrounded by what looked to be heather. Interesting choice, as the heather would be striking with its purple blooms in spring. She'd always loved heather. It was hard to argue with anything that shouted out with joy that the new year had arrived, that spring had finally sprung, and that basically told everybody to get off their butts and to get out of their houses because it was a new world out there. She smiled at her own quirkiness and got busy taking pictures. At the third garden, the carnations were planted in stripes. A dwarf type apparently was used, as the flowers were about 2/3 the heights of the others she'd seen, yet the size worked lovely as a centerpiece. She studied the garden from the front, and then walked all the way around to see the whole effect. She froze, her breath coming out in short choppy gasps. Forcing herself to move, her gaze still locked on the bed, she called Mac. His line was busy. She tried a second time, then a third. When she still couldn't get through, she switched to camera mode, but, before she could take a picture, her phone rang. "Nothing is there at the house on Hawthorne Street," Mac said. "No vehicles, nobody outside. The doors to the house were unlocked, but the house itself appears empty when we peered in the windows." Fatigue colored his tone of voice. "So it's a false alarm." "No, it's not," she said. "I need you to come here. Like now." "Doreen, are you okay?" His voice was sharp. "No," she snapped. "I'm not okay." "Come here right now," she said. "What are you talking about?" She cried out, "I'll show you." "Hold on. I'm sending a picture." She hung up, switched back to camera mode, and took a picture of the absolutely stunning carnation garden and the dead body lying in the middle of it.